bonjour. By this time of year, obviously with Poppy Day looming, and it's expanded in recent years, and rightfully so, dedicated to all the fallen men and women, and men and women that are suffering because of war, you know, etc., etc. I think we all know. And I'm not going to. This video isn't to go there, except to say, just my humble dedication of this video to the essence of what we do this for, because I wanted to do, basically I wanted to do a little overview in my own little way of Charley's War, one of the finest comic book war stories you're ever going to read. End of. And I can't think of any argument against what I just said. That's how superb what I'm going to show you is. But what I wanted to do firstly was just give my humble dedication to the fallen and the suffering because of war. But for my generation, it used to be more about World War One, because it was on the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day, and it has a resonance, particularly in Europe, and I can't speak for other Europeans, but particularly in England, it's quite a prolific effect it had on the entire population. There's hardly anyone you know that hasn't had a great granddad or a granddad, like my generation I'm talking about now, by the way, that had a part in the war. Even more so with the Second World War, but because I'm doing Charley's War, and I'm just gonna, just on a little person, that's my granddad, and now he fought in the Somme, Northamptonshire Regiment. I'm not going to give away all my personal details on your line, you understand, but I'm not making it up. That's my granddad in Northamptonshire Regiment. My father-in-law's father, little postcard that he sent, like I'm saying, all these little that connects you to a war. And me personally, obviously read war comics as a kid, and I would say it makes you anti-war. If you've got any kind of, I think if you've got a modicum of intelligence, it makes you anti-war. When Charley's War come along, it was something completely different. Written by Pat Mills and drawn by Joe Colquhoun. I hope I'm getting his name right. That's how I pronounced it all my life, so I can't stop now. But I don't mean any disrespect to Joe. But drawn in absolute exquisite detail by Joe Colquhoun, and we are going to get into it. I'm going to talk more about him, but I just want to get this little bit of preamble out of the way. And then I went on to write, in my later years, I went on to write Commando war comics. So you can see how I've kind of been immersed in war comics and the periphery in Britain, growing up, you know, being a teenager in the early 80s. All right. And having an affinity is the wrong word, but having a respect for it, because it's hard to get the words right, really, about being a fan of war, but not of war, but of the war comics and the creativity and the artwork and everything. You know, we have got to separate. I think what I'm trying to get at is we have got to separate all these fictions from the actual events. Charley's War is a completely different animal altogether, which I'm going to show you. If you haven't seen it, Titan still do the graphic novels. Now, obviously, just before I get into the comics, I will just mention one thing. A few years ago, I actually produced a World War One film, which I'm very proud of. This was a design from an idea by me, just to promote the film, and we released it. So check that out if you want. I'm proud of it. It's not going to win any Oscars, but I'm proud of what all the guys and girls achieved collectively. It took a humongous team effort. I'm really proud of that. But you can see how it has resonated with me. World War One and war stories in general, because I ended up writing a few in the late 90s. Only about 14, 15, but they are all published. They are all there. And this guy, so Charley's War turns up in battle. Now, it would just seem, wouldn't it, that it was just a boy's own story. And what I'm going to do is compare the colouring. What I think is how it had more impact. It had more power in black and white, if I'm honest. But it was meticulously researched by Pat Mills, who wrote it. This was in the early 80s, so we're going from 81. We'll go through some dates and that in these Titan. I'm going to go through. Now, the reason I'm going to go through these Titan hardcover editions is because it is wonderful to see this stuff back in print. Don't forget, this is early 80s. This is early 80s, these war comics, and to see these back, and I believe they are still in print. I'm pretty sure that they keep these on the shelves, so these will be easy to get. 10, I think it's 10 volumes. How many have I got here? 10 or 8, is it? Oh, anyway, you'll find out. Collects the whole thing, and it is one beautiful piece of work. All these volumes. Look at that. Written with intelligence, power, and deep research. Everything was well researched. Everything we'll be showing you here, and it is, and some of it does look fantastical, but it isn't. Pat Mills researched it, and Joe Colquhoun also done his own research on top. In some of these books, it's got some really interesting examples of how Joe used photos of, actual photos of the war in his artwork as reference, which a lot of artists do. But this guy was taking, and we'll just quickly, if you can just see, we will go into it, but if you can just see the kind of detail this man got, this artist got into. There's 3 pages. It was taken in 5 days. I mean, this is one of the later issues, so it's 3 and a bit pages. Look, it just goes over onto the 3.5 pages because I've had to squeeze in Private Sweetly. But there you go. That's 1981 for you in British comics. But let's have a look at Charley's War and how it so far, we're talking about early 80s, it has never been surpassed. I collect comics, I've written collect war comics, written war comics. I know they don't come out that very often, but this isn't Sergeant Rock. It isn't. I've got nothing against Sergeant Rock. I've got plenty of those comics, but it's, for want of a better word, it's real. It's real because the events happen. That they do. Pat Mills structured this story to follow the events of the war. So Charley joins just shortly before the Somme, which my granddad fought in, and was one of the lucky ones because 60,000 people died. I'm not a military historian, but what I do know is 60,000 men died the first day. And the other thing I do know, because I've just been reading up on the Charley's War books actually before doing this video, is that nearly 500,000, it would kill nearly 500,000 men. That battle, not that war. Let that sink in. 500,000 in the battle, nearly. And I know these, like I say, I'm not a military historian. But anyway, we're going to get into Charley's War, and I'm using, like I say, I'm using these rather. It's going to be easier for me for a start, and also in black and white. It looks better. It looks better than the glary colour. To be fair, I don't think using the 4-colour print on this not bad, but the typical cheap newsprint paper of the time does it any justice. If anything, sepia would have worked, but in black and white I think it resonates more. Time for the scroll. Let's get into it. Right, so let's get into this. Look, you're in for a treat. If you have never encountered Charley's War before, you are in for a treat. Now it starts off dated June the 2nd, 1916, just a couple of weeks before the Battle of the Somme. Now, I know I said that this black and white printing on this nice glossy paper is better, but this probably isn't representative of it because of his. But look at this lovely black. I'd love to see the original of this stuff. This guy, Joe Colquhoun, this artwork is pencil and ink by brush. This is ink brush. This, you couldn't get a more classical artwork than this. Now I know this is all the traditional, this isn't very exciting in and of itself, but bear with me when I show you the detail that this guy, and this is, I reckon this was photo reference, I don't know, but I reckon things like this were all photo reference, and Joe Colquhoun added. You won't have ever seen an artwork like this. You won't ever have seen artwork like this. And then we're in the trenches now. Look at the detail in these panels. You've only that's the first issue. That's the first. And Charley's War ended up being the most popular strip in the comic. Eventually, and I did. At the beginning, I did like it, and they didn't overdo it. I don't think Pat Mills used this for very long. I think after the song, he dropped it. But the postcards home, I thought was a really nice. Instead of narration, I thought it was a very clever, because Pat Mills is a clever writer. This is the cat that eats all the rats. That's why he's big, because the rats out there are so, you know, it's a rat infested. This is all classic stuff of In the Trenches. It's just all classic stuff, and he's underage. He's enlisted, and he's underage. So this might sound like classic stuff. Now the first thing we come across is this. Now when I'm reading this at the age of 13 or 14, and it seems like it's only years later when you see the weird and wonderful photos of World War One, you realise that this is our snipers. They actually tried this out, the Germans. And this is a sniper trying to pick off old Charley. He's trying to rescue one of his mates. And again, look at this wonderful detail. Not just one layer of barbed wire. It has to go on and overlaid by this letter. This is beautiful. In my opinion, it is beautiful. This was a nice reference with Pat Mills as well. They used to name the trenches so they knew where they were going, and when you think about it, it seems more logical. They used to name them after famous places, so you would get the Ritz and you would get Old Kent Road, and you would get, oh I don't know, the Mall, and oh yeah, look, Blighty Road. Oh, they're back in the Ritz again. I assume that's where the officers are. Here's the classic Sergeant Major. If you're English, you realise that this is a classic trope, not in just war comics, but in comedy, in anything to do with the army and the British Army, the classical, you know, Sergeant Major, sir. But he was firm but fair. Let me just say that. Now we've got some night. Look how he handles the night scene, Joe Colquhoun, with this stuff. The little silhouette there. Still got the postcards going. And this is all pre the Somme. This is all character setup. We've still got the big baddie here, because don't forget, this is still Boys Own Comics. This is still, you know, Pat Mills both and Joe Colquhoun both have got to abide by the editor saying, you know, this is still a Boys Own adventure comic. But what they not got away with, but what they did here with this comic strip, I think is outstanding and astounding. This is why they had the armour plate, and it's still, this narration is still going on, and it becomes more and more and more poignant as the story goes on, as you can imagine, because it has a feeling, it just has a feeling of telling a different story than actually what was going on. Again, just classic World War One stuff. But in between, to build up, to get to know our character, our hero, Charley, you need all this character-driven stuff. And again, I'll just draw your eye to the detail in that tiny panel on one page of comic art. I just think it was a beautiful thing to behold. At the time, I loved this strip in this comic, but probably not until later on you realise the beauty of it, and I think that's why they've reprinted it, because it's a shame that I can't say it's groundbreaking, because no one, and Pat Mills in this volume, in his introduction, he does say it's a shame that this led to nothing being done to further war stories or do something else on World War One, or it should have been more groundbreaking than it was, but it nevertheless remains beautiful. But even there's just no need for this stuff unless you love what you're doing, and that's another thing Pat Mills said about Joe Colquhoun, the artist, is the fact that back in the day he was doing this in the early 80s, and this guy started off on another British comic called Roy of the Rovers, and Roy of the Rovers is just a staple of British comics from 1950, the early 1950s onwards. This guy was the original artist on Roy of the Rovers, and the guy just has been, I don't know, with Joe Colquhoun, he hasn't got the reverence as a comic artist that he deserves. But I am going to shout about this one, so don't worry about that. And again, look at how dense this is. Now, maybe these kind of dense panels wouldn't work in another kind of war story, but certainly in the claustrophobic world of trench warfare, these heavy blacks, this heavy shading and this detail, I do think really does work. It really works. This is cartoony, I know, but gives a little bit of light in the shade. You can't have it all horror. Intro, the officer that is going to put them through their paces during the next few weeks. Now, while these classic tropes are all here, particularly for British war comics, Pat Mills weaved it into a very subversive, and I use that word carefully, into a very subversive storyline of the rich, a bit like Blackadder Goes Forth, where the rich sit miles away while the poor are sent off to slaughter. It is literally that. It is literally that. And from both sides. I mean, obviously it's Charley's war, so you're not getting the German side of it until a bit later on. But they do go over to the other side. But it's normally just that setting up. And don't forget, this is only 3 pages, and it's a weekly comic. So you really have to do beginning, middle, end to a certain extent. You know, maybe not every single week, because you've got to kind of build up storylines and stuff. Look, and again, this is, if you're ever gonna read a war story, and I know I'm emphasising the artwork here. This was nice when it was that this page probably would have been in colour, because that looks like the reproduction is kind of like blurring it all out, and I will show you some examples of when they coloured it. It's a shame that they've reproduced these pages from the plates of I don't know what, because sometimes they get quite poor. Actually, the reproduction's quite poor. Yeah, look at this stuff. Look, he's nicked one of the Germans' helmets, and that's against the rules. That's court-martial offence. Again, I hope you're getting I hope anyone who's looking at this is getting a feeling for just exactly how how great, again, another night scene, you know, we start with a silhouette. Such an accomplished, I don't know, such an accomplished piece of work. But so before Joe, I mean, Pat Mills had obviously had experience in British comics, but Joe, like I say, started off with Roy the Rovers, and it was probably a good 20 odd years into his career by then. So, but look at this guy using an ink brush, taking 5 days a week to do 3 pages, maybe 3.5. Look, that went 3.5, like I said earlier, and you can see why. Look at the detail of it. Look at the detail, and it's very, very rarely that he does the floating heads, or just look at this. I mean, this is like EC, the stuff you'd get in America, like the EC stuff. I can't quite. One of the EC artists that's reminding me of just this, but he's not copying or aping or getting an influence from it. He's just done it. It's an organic way of showing what's going on in a panel. That is just great stuff. I mean, so that's volume 1. So So on to volume 2, and like I won't go through every every page that I did there in the first volume, but let's just rest on this splash page, and what a soldier, someone on guard duty is asking Charley, what have you got in that bag, soldier? If you've been stealing supplies, ... I do like ... He didn't reply, he just carried on. I'll ask you again, what you got in the bag? Look at the bag he's carrying. My mate Ginger. Wow. This is what I mean about subversive in the early 80s, to do a war story in this way. Dream sequence about his mate that's died. You know, the poignancy. I know I'm kind of. It's easy for me to show you the outstanding artwork of Joe Colquhoun. That isn't to say that Joe's work wasn't driven by Pat Mills and his research, but Joe certainly did do. This is Charlie's sister's husband that he ends up having to. When apparently Pat Mills says that when he saw the photo of the family that Joe drew, he felt like he had to tell the story of the whole family, which he kind of eventually did. When Charlie goes home on leave, you get to know the mum and, you know, the sister, other characters. Anyway, he ends up getting into trouble, saving the cowardly. I think his name was Percy. I could be wrong now. I forgot his name now. But anyway, it was a typically. Now these tank drivers, again. When I was of a certain age reading this war comic, I thought this was marvellous. I thought this was, wow, you know, nightmare. I wasn't really thinking, oh, was that real? I was just thinking, oh yeah, that looks grim. But they did wear the chainmail, because if a bullet did go in there and sent all the fragments, that they did wear the linked chainmail, not for long, because it got too hot in the tanks apparently. And I won't get too historically heavy on the First World War, but these weeks of episodes were about the tank warfare, when they first rolled them out. And again, look at this attention to detail. Look at. And these stories kind of go into how these men would have reacted to these new machines, brand new. Imagine a brand new piece of kit, a brand new weapon of mass destruction. This is just nice. Moulin Rouge. And here we go. the ricochets. Put your mask on, lad. With all the bits of metal flying around inside. This is all fact. This is all stuff that, you know, you watch a tank, World War One tank documentary when they first rolled them out, that, you know, is literally what you're getting, and that was the depth. Now look at this. Now the rain starts. So we're into a certain era of the war, and the rain starts. And I've got to say, and you know, you could say that these are only lines of white through the shade, and these are only. But come on, guys. Anyone looking at this, how much time was spent on these panels? I think this artwork is beautiful in its what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, I'm not very eloquent, but in its it's in its impact, its truthfulness, it's in its honesty. It's beautiful in its honesty. This stuff, without getting, but nevertheless remaining true to the guys that were there. And again, you see this is where I'm saying about the reproduction of it. You see this Charley's War here. This is what happens to these comics when you can see, when this was on the cover, or even if it wasn't, you can see that the poor quality of the paper means that the comic strip on the other side would have been bleeding through. And I know this for a fact because I've got the comics. I'll show you an example of that later. But that's a shame. That's a shame, because you can bet your life that this car was real. At some point somewhere, this was researched. It wasn't a made-up thing through some sketchy, you know, pathetic first picture that you found. And I bet that in the original, with that ink brushwork, would have looked beautiful. And here we go. Look, more typical trench stuff. And again, just those two. Look how dense they are. We've got the rats, the character, and the characterisation. Every week, you have to make sure we know who Charley is, we know who Duffy is, we know who Ginger is, we know who Sarge is. I mean, I know that's quite. You would think that's easy with his thin little moustache, but nevertheless, no, it isn't. It isn't easy. It's a man at the top of his game, I think. Top of his game. At the back of every one of these books, you get a little commentary by Pat Mills, which is lovely behind the scenes stuff. This third volume, we will go straight in to the covers again. Now this is when the reproduction isn't coming back very well. But I thought this, I never forgot since the first time I read it in the early 80s. And I'm going to linger on it. And what a wonderful thing Pat Mills did here about the end of the Battle of the Somme. And how beautifully, and it still does send a little bit of a shiver down my spine when he's ghosted out. He's just done. You could call this, no, I don't know what you could call it. Not typical, but the way this is done. From this, the great muck up, as the Tommies called it, ended on November the 18th in a blinding snowstorm. The soldiers were driven to breaking point, and it ends up 500,000 Tommies like Charley were killed or wounded in the Battle of the Somme. The total gain was 7 miles and 3 villages. I think that right there, what a beautiful, if that was a storyboard for a film by Steven Spielberg, like he done Schindler's List, you know, you've got Oscars aplenty there. with him storyboarding a First World War film. Just again, just beautiful stuff. He goes home on leave afterwards, so we're reintroduced to, I'm sure it was Percy. Oh, it's Oliver, my Oliver. Oh, Oily, he calls him. That's it, Oily. So he calls him Oily when he meets him in the trenches. But now we're introduced to Charlie's home life, and his mum is what they called a canary. Now the canaries were the women that worked in the musicians' factories. Now all this is soap opera stuff, really, but nevertheless, this blind old boy here, Wilf. I think he was a veteran of Crimea, so he's a veteran of another war, but he's blind. But he helps. They had listening posts for the Zeppelins in World War One. This is just beautiful stuff. Here we go. This is just beautiful stuff. I don't care what anyone else says. It just is. For Pat Mills to come up with that conceit. And then we've got, obviously, they're all running down the London Underground because of the Zeppelins dropping bombs. But Wilf is still there listening out. There's one more they've got to get. Charlie wants to go home, look, on his bike, or not go home, but go to. They're obviously aiming for the munitions factory where his mum works. And like I say, these women that worked in the munitions factories in World War One, they turned yellow. Their skin went yellow, and they were called canaries because they went yellow because of the chemicals in the munitions, and they was like socially, what would be the politically correct version of it now? They were socially ostracised, and just another all these little facts that Pat Mills was digging up. Now I've got this as a bookmark in this one to show you how I know the reproduction value is poor, but how much better does that look in black and white, even with the grey tone? It's just a shame they can't. I mean, this is wonderful. I mean, to be fair, I've only just noticed that. And I've had this comic since 1981. And like I say, you can tell. I don't know if you can see where the battle on the other side is seeping through the page, which you can tell the reproduction of the. But this is almost. I'm thinking now that this is almost sepia. This is almost sepia now. These pages have yellowed over 41 years. Look at his artwork in this tone, this yellow. Gorgeous. Tell you what, if they could do a graphic novel in this tone of paper, which is almost sepia. Just a little side note within the Scruffy area, this character, the Scruffy area, is that Joe Colquhoun, this artist, was the dog's back, look. Joe was asked just before his death in 1987, bless him, to do Slain for 2000 AD. Now this man could have drawn anything. He could have drawn anything, to be fair. But yeah, I just thought that was a nice little nugget of trivia. Gas scenes, look. Just had a look at that, haven't we? But gas scenes. Now the heavy munitions are coming out when these big machine guns started coming out. Look, showing the actual. Look how much just in one panel is squeezed in. How many characters? A bit like George Perez drawing the Avengers. He needed to get all them characters in, didn't he? And there are other artists that love it, but this guy was drawing British comics weekly, and that weren't good money. You had to love it. You had to really love it. I don't know I can't remember this storyline here with this guy, but obviously Pat Mills had discovered discovered a little piece of trivia. No, beautiful stuff. Look, beautiful stuff. He was a Londoner, so we've got West Ham Corporation, look, tramways. Right, so on to this next volume, 4, I believe. And again, I have bookmarked, just to show you, because this is such a poor quality, what a shame we couldn't see, because they've taken this straight from the colour and it's greyed everything out. It's a real shame. It's a real shame. It's my only criticism really of these books. But how good it is in black and, you know, I'm just trying to, and again, let's go through the story in the sepia colours, in that nice yellowed, just look at the detail, you know, hand grenades, that just, and the silhouettes in the background, just as a piece of design. I mean, I don't know how much of the script would have been describing these scenes, but the description for this one panel would have been a page of A4 to describe everything in it: a bayonet, a grenade, look, machine gun jutting out. Just look how much attention the man has put into that, how much detail the man has put into it. Just beautiful stuff. It just really is. And again, look, this, you know, tally ho, what did you join the army for and all that, look, that was the original issue. That doesn't look too bad actually, because these all look quite light colours, aren't they? But didn't it look better in black and white rather than this garish? For some reason, I even thought this at the time, that this garish colouring, but these guys have got a comic to sell. This is in the newsagents. This is all in America on the newsstand. You know, with that would probably be up against at least half a dozen. In 1981, this was up against half a dozen other comics to attract someone's eye. Well, to attract a boy's eye, to pull his mum's arm or his dad's arm to get him to buy a comic. And I don't know why they played around with the logo and all that back in the day, but again, these are decisions editors need to make to try and sell comics, to try and keep the numbers up. Just as a little look how good, look, he was very, very adept at aircraft, and he, by the way, Joe Colquhoun served in the Navy in the Second World War. He was he liked sailing, and apparently, and this is only what I've read up, you know, like I say, I didn't know the guy, but look how nicely these two panels are done again. You know, boys of a certain age, it's just going to blow your mind, and it did. Show about that again, because this is a nice, you know, and again, heavily researched by Pat Mills. None of this would have been, but this is the other thing I loved with this strip, is these characters that you would never that would get you through the story, but the subversive part of Pat Mills' writing is layering. He's using these characters, but my God, he layered the story with enough detail that made it, you know, so that it wasn't, you didn't feel like he was being treated like a child at all, ever. This last volume would just I've bookmarked, so I'm not going through the whole lot. This is just the last one, and again, it's the reproduction that has added something for me to these pages, and again, it's the rain, it's the mud, it's World War One, but the pacing of it. If you was going to storyboard a film, and bearing in mind I have done a World War One film, and if I'd have had storyboards like this, I don't know what. Just, yeah, and the more you're reading it, the more you're enjoying it. Like more of the classic stuff. He loves a little bit of rain, don't he? Colquhoun, but I did as well. I did as well reading this. Look at this. Again, this nightmarish vision of a war that it's like Pat Mills describes it in these volumes as like the first bad war, and all wars are bad, but this, for some reason, World War One is a bad war, isn't it? Here come the Aussies, Anzacs, what they called Anzacs back in the First World War, saving the day from the, you know, this volume and the later stories had a lot more of a political slant to it, with the mutinies and escaping and anti-authoritarian, which is pure Pat Mills. You got to love him for it, but it's pure Pat Mills. We'll leave that one there, but like I say, we're getting on towards the end of the kind of story proper, so to speak. And here we go, The Great Mutiny, this volume's called. And these, when you look at these pictures, these photographs of this war, and you realise the research that both Pat Mills did for the story and Joe did for the artwork, just outstanding, work. This just has a darker, for me, from here, it just has a darker feel to it. Just a darker tone, and I know you can't get a lot darker than World War One. So this is right at the end of the Charley's World War One story, and I really did like this. I've remembered this. So he's a stretcher bearer in 1917. Bearing in mind that Charley is still he's only 18 because he enlisted underage. My last carry. He's my last carry. If this was an EC war comic, that would have been called The Last Carry, and they would have done an intense, 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 pages. And I'm not saying all the EC war stuff isn't any good. I'm saying they're up there with this stuff. And they also, stuff like this, you can't. But, well, perhaps it's good that it's never been replicated and no one's tried doing another World War One. A bit like Blackadder Goes Forth, which I know I started mentioning earlier on, but I'm like a ramble off on a tangent. Now, this stuff, suddenly, when we get in towards the end of things, he's a stretcher bearer and all that, now we come back into more or less present day. And the trip. Now, what does this remind you of? Two old boys going to the war memorial in France. Yeah, this predates Saving Private Ryan by a good 30 years. Well, yeah, 20, 25 years. So just bear that in mind. This predates that film. Pat Mills wrote this, all of this stuff that has resonated throughout our not just I'm talking comics here, resonated through our society since the beginning of this century. I think it's resonated more with people, all this stuff, and the sacrifices these young men made, and look how dark, because these are darker times now. It's almost like the war so far has been righteous, but now we're getting into the dark, the proper industrial warfare side of things. With the big tanks and the big guns and the big machine guns and the aeroplanes, like the tanks, and it's almost like it's a darker. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. But I think it's just nice to leave it with, and also towards the end, they tried doing a couple of, from the Germans' point of view, which, let's face it, would have been the same as Charley's point of view. There would have been a Charley's War in German. Just flip it. Just flip it and write it in German. Could have been the same, and just change the geography and where he come from. It would have been the same for them. It would have definitely been the same for them. And we leave it. So we're doing the German sign, the side of the trenches, and we leave it. I just thought this was a beautiful thing Pat Mills done. Here we go. Yeah, he never complains like the rest of us. He loves the stinking trenches. Shh, here he comes. They're talking about someone. So sharp running. Corporal Adolf Hitler is the best runner in the regiment. That's how he started. That's how that's what the man did. He was in the First World War. What just a great way. Just a great way of ending the story. I will leave it there, and I hope you've enjoyed going through. Let me just show you. I hope you've enjoyed going through all these. Look, you've got the strip comment. These books are beautiful. They really are, because of the artwork, because of Pat Mills' devotion and passion and enthusiasm, and likewise for Joe Colquhoun. And this was really interesting, because I've been leafing through these again for this. Various attempts to have Charley's War artwork exhibited in British war museums, including the Imperial War Museum, but so far without any success. I don't know what year this was written, but he says, we've been more fortunate in France, and I'm told that Charley's War was included in an exhibition at the Historial de la Grande Guerre Museum earlier this year. So I don't know what year that was, but this stuff I've just been showing you was exhibited in. I love that. I love that, and I will leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you've enjoyed the tribute. This is a tribute to Pat Mills, what Pat Mills and John Colquhoun did, but also in a tiny, silly little way, but respectful way. I hope you've enjoyed this tribute to the men and women who died and who are suffering from all of these travails. And on that note, I will bid you adios.